Well, once again, good morning and welcome to all the moms and grandmoms. We are happy that you are here with us today, as well to all of the spiritual moms out there, those that are investing in the next generation of young people to know and follow Jesus. Salary.com every year does this research where they discern how much a mom should be making every year. January, they came out with their salaries for moms. Based upon the craziness of this past year and how many moms had to as well do the double effort of working their external jobs from home as well as being a mom at home, Salary.com has determined, are you ready? In 2021, a mom is worth $178,000 a year. That's pretty good. We won't ask how many of you feel like you are getting that. We won't ask. We look to our moms today especially. When you're a young child, a young baby, you look to your mom with joy and comfort. I remember my youngest son when he would cry in the middle of the night and I would try to warm his spirits and encourage him, and he would look at me, continue to cry. Mom would walk in the room and what would happen? When you're a young child, you look to mom, don't you? When you're a young kid and you skin your knee and you come in and you come to dad, he usually says, clean it up. When you hurt your knee, where do you want to go when you're a kid? Oh, you want to go to mom. And let's be honest, even as you get older in life, when there's challenges, and boy, are there challenges, when there's failure, and yeah, there's failures as well. When things get hard, no doubt, you still look to mom. You look to mom for encouragement. You look to mom for hope. And this morning, I want us to look to our moms, to the example of mothers as much more than just the one who brings the salve to our burned out knees, the one who gives more than just comfort in the middle of the night. But as we look to our moms this morning, I want us to catch a glimpse of how our moms reveal to us the very character of God. I believe that moms at their best, when you look at them, you could see the very nature and character and love of our God. And this morning, my prayer is that as we look to moms this morning, we look to God more intently this morning, and we look in our own life and see how God extends that same type of concern and love for us. I want to start off this morning by looking at one of these Old Testament stories of motherhood, one of these stories that always gets me giggling whenever I read it, and one of these stories that always makes me think, wow, I wish I would have thought of that. It's a story in 1 Kings chapter 3. It's a story of Solomon. You remember Solomon? He is the son of David. The kingship has now been handed to him, and he is to lead and guide the nation of Israel. And in chapter 3, Solomon asks of God. Actually, God asks of Solomon, I'm going to give you anything you want. What do you want? Now, think about this. What if God said to you, what do you want? I'll give it to you. I got a pretty long list. Do you? Oh, Lord, I could think of some things I'd like, some creature comforts I would like, some people I would like you to move aside a little bit in my life. But anyway, Solomon comes before God and Solomon says, I want, do you remember what he asked for? Wisdom, that Hebrew word, chokhmah, right? I want skill in the art of godly living. I want to shepherd and guide your people as a nation. I need wisdom. And God says, because you've asked for it, I will give it to you. And I as well will bless you and use you abundantly. And then in chapter 3, we see this first very practical, pretty wild scene where God calls Solomon to demonstrate his wisdom. The text is primarily about demonstrating the wisdom that God had given to this leader. But he uses the first example of these two mothers that come to Solomon. They come to Solomon with a problem. In 1 Kings 3, it tells us that both of these mothers had children. And one of these children died in the night. And they both woke up the next morning. And they both claimed that the one who is still alive is my child. Can you imagine this? Put yourself in this place. If you're a mom, even if you're a father, could you imagine this? One of these children has died, and there's another person who is claiming that that child is mine. And so both of these mothers come to King Solomon, and they say, figure this out. Have you ever been in a situation like that? Where it seems like a crazy trap no matter which way you go? Figure this one out, Solomon. And Solomon uses great wisdom. Do you remember what he says? Solomon looks out to both mothers and this one child, and he says to those around them, bring me a sword. Solomon, bring me a sword, verse 25. Cut the living boy in two and give half to one and half to the... one of these amazing texts. I have several very beautiful images of this. This has been painted throughout history. Raphael has this amazing fresco that he did on this scene, but I thought on Mother's Day it wasn't the best picture to show. Most of them show a guard holding a baby by its foot with a sword in its arm. But this is what Solomon does. And listen to the words of the mother in verse 26. The woman whose son was alive spoke to the king because she felt great compassion for her son. My lord, give her the living baby, she said, but please don't have him killed. Can you believe it? Compassion. That's our theme this morning as we consider mothers. This mother had such compassion for her son, who she knew was his, that she was willing to give him up in order that he might be alive. Now, you know the way the story unfolds for Solomon. His great wisdom is praised as he laid out this impossible situation, and the right mother chose the right way forward. But for us this morning, I want us to focus on this word, compassion. This great word in the Hebrew Old Testament, rachum. It's this idea of being deeply moved by the vulnerability and the pain of someone else and responding. Being deeply moved by the pain, the vulnerability, the sad situation of someone else, and then saying, it is not enough for me to shed a tear, it is not enough for me to walk aside, I need to respond. This same word, compassion, is used several times in the Old Testament to talk about God himself. This same word, rachum, compassion. In Exodus chapter 34, it's a scene for the nation of Israel as they are wandering in the wilderness. In verse 6, God says to his people, this is how you will know me. I am the Lord your God, and I am, say the word, compassionate and gracious. Same word. I am a compassionate God. I am deeply moved by vulnerability and pain, and I'm going to do something about it. I'm going to respond. Later on in the same Old Testament, in Isaiah chapter 49, this for a nation that finds themselves in exile out of the nation of Israel, hundreds of years later, God says this about himself. Listen to what he says. This is verse 15. Can a woman forget her nursing child? Or lack, what do you think the word is? Compassion for the child of her womb. Even if these forget, God says, I will not forget you. God is a God of compassion. And when we look to a mom and see her deeply moved by the vulnerability and the need of the children God has entrusted into her care. And when we watch how she responds in love and grace, we get a picture. We get an earthly snapshot of God's character, that God is a God like this. I remember the first time I saw the compassion of my wife for my kids against my really just boneheadedness. My oldest son, he was just a month or so old, and we took him to the doctors for his checkups. And, when little kids are born and you get to bring them to the doctor for checkup, they do all these testings, and they say, well, your child, I want you to know, he is in the 90th percentile for weight. I'm thinking, wow, my son's already an A student. He's, and they go through all these lists and checkoffs, and you feel good about yourself. You kept him alive for a month, and he's ranking high, Harvard is in the future, right? And they were evaluating him, and they're looking over my son, and they open his mouth, and they say, oh, okay, well, we noticed something with his tongue. Underneath his tongue, that little piece of flesh under there? It is too far up his tongue. And if we don't snip it, he won't be able to speak properly when he gets older. And so I said, no problem, let's do it right now. And the doctor said, no, that you need a specialist for this, and you got to go to Brooklyn, because I guess that's where the specialists are, okay? There's no specialists on Highland Boulevard, I don't know, So we go to Brooklyn, and we drive over there, and I'm annoyed because I got to go over the bridge, obviously. I got to find a spot. We're real Staten Islanders, we don't like to leave. And we go in our doctor's office there, and they sit us in the room for this procedure. And I'm talking to the doctor, this really sharp, wonderful lady. And she starts telling me about the reasons for this and why they can make this incision so easily and how it's not an area where there's a lot of blood and it's going to be great. And I'm thinking that to myself, I don't want to learn about this. This is interesting, And so I'm asking her questions. And my wife is sitting there holding my little buddy on the ground, on the chair. So she says, would you like to watch me do it? I said, I can. Absolutely. So I said, Mandy, you're okay holding him, right? So my wife is holding my little son, holding his head back, as someone else pries open his mouth. And I'm on the other side with the doctor there, and I'm leaning right on her shoulder. And she's talking me through the procedure, and I'm like, oh, yes, okay, yes. She takes out that little scissor and little snip. And I said to her, that was amazing. That was, I should have been a doctor. I'm really interested in this kind of thing, And we're talking back and forth. And all of a sudden, I looked to my wife and my son. And my son, because of the great shock of the moment, had his mouth wide open and just started crying but couldn't get words out. Do you know those kind of screams for a little kid? And behind him, my wonderful, compassionate wife is crying nonstop. A compassion of a mother is like no other. Am I right? And God tells us when we look to our moms, when we see compassion like this, it is a picture for you of my compassion for you. How I am likewise not just a stone cold dad watching a procedure, but how I, like a compassionate mother, see your vulnerability, see your need, understands the pain you are going through, and responds. Steps closer towards you. This morning, no matter what pain, no matter what vulnerability, no matter what even consequences you are reaping in your own life because of sinful choices you may be making, know that the God we worship is a compassionate God who draws near to you and desires that you might feel the comfort and the forgiveness that comes through him. Are you with me? And then we turn the page. We look to our moms and we look to the God of the Old Testament, but we know as followers of Jesus Christ that as men and women of the new covenant, that when we come to know and worship Jesus, We get to see in his life and in how he lives divine compassion in the flesh. That Jesus, when his life and in his ministry, lived out of a heart of compassion for people, out of a love for people. The Greek word in the New Testament, oiktirmos, conveys this truth over and over again, to be deeply moved and to move towards those in need. Here's just several of the many instances in the scriptures where Jesus is talked about with his compassion. I wanted you to hear these one after another this morning. In Matthew 9, when Jesus sees the crowds, he had compassion for them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. When Jesus saw the crowds gathering to him, needing hope, vulnerable, in pain, lost, abused by those religious and political leaders of the day, when Jesus saw the crowds coming to him because of the hype of who he was and what he was doing, Jesus had compassion. Oiktirmos. Jesus was deeply moved. In Matthew 14, when he went ashore, he saw a great crowd and he had compassion on them and he healed the sick. I love it. Notice, once again, you have to get this through. We have to remember this. Compassion is not just warm, fuzzy feelings when we see something emotional on TV and then we forget and move on and ask, what's for dinner, or did you buy ice cream, Compassion is to be deeply moved and then to respond. And Jesus here with these crowds sees them, and as the sick come to him, he heals them. He heals them. He responds with his power when they come to him in their vulnerability and pain. Do you hear that this morning? That Jesus responds powerfully in our life when we come to him, even when we are most vulnerable and in pain. Someone needs to hear that this morning. Then Jesus called his disciples to him and said, I have compassion on the crowd because they have seen me now 3 days and have nothing to eat. I'm unwilling to send them away hungry lest they faint on the way. Do you remember what happens then? The great miracle of feeding through the fish and the bread. A good meal is a great way to demonstrate compassion. Jesus, time and again, just a few more in Luke 7. And when the Lord saw her, this is the widow who lost her son, whose son had died. And he said to her, I have compassion on her. Do not weep. Do you know what Jesus does next? Raises that boy. Jesus, deeply moved and responding. Luke 15, and he arose and came to his father. Who are we talking about here? That prodigal son. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion and ran and embraced him and kissed him. You remember the prodigal, don't you? The prodigal that said basically to the father and the mother by extension, it is as good to me as if you are dead. Let me have my inheritance. And this prodigal spends it all, finds himself eating what the pigs eat, you remember? And he returns to the father, and the father sees him coming towards him, and the father saw him and felt compassion on this one who not too far in the recent past had almost said as if, I wish you were dead. And he showed compassion. And he ran to him and he embraced him and he kissed him. Do you see the compassion of God in this story? That God sees us in our vulnerability and in our need, even when the reason why we are experiencing pain and loss is because of our own poor, sinful choices. And if we're honest this morning, some of us are on that path. Some of us are reaping in our life sadness and pain and loss and difficulty and failure. And it's because we have been complicating things through sinful choices, through prideful arrogance, through lack of compassion and love for those around us. And yet, even if we are the ones who are running from God most of the time, when we make a simple turn, what does God do for us? He runs towards us. He offers compassion. Some of us here this morning need to repent and turn and find a Father, a God who wants to love and show his concern for you. We look to our moms for the example of compassion. And when we look to them, we look to God and we see Jesus. Are you with me this morning? When we look to Jesus, we see the compassion of God in the flesh. And I love this story in Luke 13, where Jesus looks out on the nation of Israel and on the city of Jerusalem. And he says, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stone those who are sent to her, how often I wanted to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. Jesus, talking about his own compassion, uses the example of a mother hen. I love it. Jesus uses the example of a mother's compassion to talk about his own compassion. And he says, like a mother hen wants to gather and protect and care for the chicks, I wanted to do that for you. I desired to do that, but you were not willing. You were not willing to receive it. You know, this may ring especially true for some moms and spiritual moms here today, and dads and spiritual dads as well, that there may be people in your life, children in your life that you have been praying for, investing in, caring for, wanting to see them come to know, to follow, to be obedient to Jesus. You want, like Jesus, to show compassion and to welcome them. Who does not want to welcome the prodigal, right? But perhaps they still don't want to receive it. This text is a reminder that even Jesus had limits to the people that were able to experience his compassion because they need to respond and be willing to receive it. So whoever you are showing this type of compassion to, even though it's a hard case, whoever you're showing this kind of love to, even though they don't want it in return, do not stop that heart of compassion. Like Jesus. Jesus, divine compassion in the flesh. He was deeply moved by the vulnerability and the pain of those around him, and he responded. Have you received that compassion this morning? Are you a recipient of this compassion this morning? We look to Mom for this example. We look to Jesus as divine compassion in the flesh. And now, are you ready? Guess what? God calls us to share that compassion with those around us. That completes the circle. Look to your mom today and think of the character of God. And when you look to God and receive his compassion, know that now God has entrusted you to be a person that shares the compassion of him with those around you. Jesus says in Luke 6:36, be merciful, the same word, oiktirmos, just as your Father is merciful and compassionate. Ephesians 4:32, be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as Christ forgave. I love that. I love it. Show compassion. Show forgiveness. Why? That's what Jesus has shown you. And if you have received it, that enables you to offer it freely. Offer the forgiveness and compassion of God to those around you, especially those that make it hard. Especially those that don't receive it often with open arms. We get to participate in relieving the suffering in this world, the suffering in our relationships, the suffering in our community when we partner with God in demonstrating His compassion to those around us. Like a mother, as Jesus did, be deeply moved by the vulnerability and pain of others and respond. Will you do that this week? Will you be deeply moved by the vulnerability and pain, even the outright sinfulness and wrong behavior of those around you, and show compassion, desiring to see how you might be used by God to point Him to Himself? A couple questions here as we close. First, have you accepted this compassion of Jesus? Have you in your own life recognized how far you fall short? Have you in your own life confessed your own sins and failures? Have you in your own life admitted those times, those places, those ways where you have not measured up? And have you received the very compassion and forgiveness of God? We heard it this morning from Diana. I have received the very forgiveness and compassion and love of God, and it's a free gift that He offers to all of us. And you can have it right now before you leave. We admit our sin and failure. We believe that Jesus died and rose again for us. We confess Him as Lord in our life and say, Jesus, I want to follow you. When we do that, we receive His compassion. We can receive His forgiveness, His love, His restoration in our life. And this is the starting point of being a compassionate person in this world. You know, if we think we could be a compassionate person just because, well, I'm a good person and I'm a very optimistic, outgoing person, you know what? There comes a point in time when you continue to show compassion and then you start thinking, I want to see you respond. Do you know somebody like that? Do you have somebody like that in your life? A child, a grandchild? Do you have somebody like that in your life? A friend, a family member, a coworker that you show compassion with and then you feel like you've run out of the will to show it anymore? Oh, just me. You are the most holy people. If we do not give compassion out of a response to God's compassion towards us, we will run out. We will stop. There will come a breaking point in our life where we'll say, it's just not worth it. They're too far gone. But if you've received the very eternal forgiveness and compassion of God in your life, then who can you give it to? Who in your life can you share it with? Moms, show it to your kids. Let them see in you the very passion and love of God. May they see in you a little picture of the love that God has for them. Don't stop, especially when it's hard and especially when they're not receiving it. Be compassionate. And who in your spheres of influence might God be calling you this very week? Men, women, young people, to share the very hope, compassion of God. Keep at it. Keep at it. For the moms today that maybe are feeling a little overwhelmed by all of the needs around them and all the people that are clinging to them, God has shown compassion to you. Give it freely and trust Him. Don't give compassion as a tool of manipulation to get them to do what you want. Give it freely and entrust them to God's care. Watch. For moms today that are perhaps a little overwhelmed and realize, man, I want to offer that compassion, but I've also really said some nasty things to my kids recently, or, I've shown where I've messed up and where I've fallen, and man, I'm humbled by those things, and confess it, because you needed compassion from God. And watch how God uses your acts of humility to change. And for those of you that have experienced pain and loss, for moms here today, stepmoms and spiritual mothers that have seen children go through pain and loss, or perhaps you've lost your own child in the not too recent past, and you're hard for you to think about what it means to share compassion with others, know that as we look to you, we're looking to Jesus. And we're looking to share compassion to the world around us. Be comforted that the God of all grace and compassion can comfort you. There was a woman, her name is Becky O'Connell. She has been given a unique title, the Baby Whisperer. Officially, this 65-year-old woman is a temporary foster care worker. She said in the Chicago Tribune, she keeps baby clothes always stacked on the table near her door of all various sizes. The white wicker bassinet is at any moment, day or night, ready to receive a call from a social worker who needs to place an infant in her care. Becky says that some of the children have been abandoned, others have been abused, but all of them are desperate for love and touch and attention. Aren't we all? So far, Mrs. O'Connell has taken in 77 infants. Isn't that amazing? The road to this unique call wasn't easy. In 1999, her youngest son, Ian, was killed in a car accident. And for years and years after her death, she said, I couldn't even concentrate. I looked and acted like a normal person. She said a few years later, she began to gain her balance, and she read about this opportunity at a local adoption center, that they needed temporary foster care. And she said, loving these babies is a dream job. If she has a secret, she says, it's simply giving each child her undivided attention. I think that's compassion. Seeing children vulnerable and giving attention. She adds, people think that babies bring lots of disorder and confusion to a household, but I'm here to tell you it's not the babies who are disordered and confused, it's the adults. And O'Connell says simply, my job is simply to fall in love with these babies. For however long she has them. God is deeply moved by our pain and vulnerability, by our sinfulness and our choices and the things that keep us far from Him. He was so moved that He sent His Son to live and die on our behalf, to rise again to new life, divine compassion in the flesh. And as we look to our moms and see a snapshot of Jesus, God calls us, if we've received that love, to fall in love with others, to respond to their need, and to point them to the compassion and love of God eternal. Are you with me this morning? Who can you share God's compassion with? And have you received the very compassion of God?